I think story is a problem for video games, but story is also one of the most interesting goals a game can strive to achieve.
The Wii U has launched, the PlayStation 4 has been announced, and we know Microsoft has something brewing. Development engines are exploding, with supercharged creativity and expansive feature sets becoming easier to use than ever before. But there's more to games than gigabytes of RAM.
Increasing the richness of content achievable on the platform.
Most games, you walk into a space and you're like, oh, okay, I see. I need to kill these like 4 knife-wielding dudes, and then that door will magically open.
2012 was a year that saw The Walking Dead, an episodic licensed game, propel itself into the spotlight through careful wordsmithing, voice acting, and a fractured, if congruent, storyline. Collecting heaps of industry awards, The Walking Dead won Game of the Year at the VGAs and was nominated for a slew of BAFTAs, cinching the Best Story award. On the other side of the same coin was Journey, a wordless desert meandering, poignant, vague, and adored.
Looking back, seeing the combinations of how narrative was added to unexpected genres like first-person shooter suddenly as a story.
If you feel you have been exposed to radioactive or other hazardous materials in the course of your duties.
In early 2013, the Independent Games Festival announced a new category for excellence in narrative, further signs that something was fermenting here. The smoldering smoke of story was indexical to the fire at hand. Is a renaissance of video game tale-telling ready to erupt? The state of story is the question at hand here. We've posed it to an industry veteran, a critic novelist turned game writer, one of the IGF nominees, and an indie developer who's living the dream. Like Journey, answers and agreement are murky and intangible, but also like The Walking Dead, the splintering paths and opinions all work out to an inevitable, thoughtful conclusion.
What about the food situation? What about protection? What about when this place falls?
I still kind of see games as kind of being there's a lot of unexplored territory.
It's interesting, I think, in the very beginning of games, like if you look at Infocom, like the text adventures, story there was really prominent, and it kind of had a lull for a long time, and I'm not totally sure why it's made a resurgence.
Movies quickly became a storytelling medium. Paintings have a kind of narrative to them, right? And there's a lot of storytelling songs. There's something about story that is incredibly powerful and taps into some of the most primal emotions we have as people.
And so I think part of the reason that story has become more important recently is just people are kind of they've exhausted the fun of the simple like, okay, I can move around and interact with the world.
And we all talk ourselves blue in the face talking about storytelling and games are a perfect fit. Storytelling and games are mismatched. But I think what we overlook in all this is the fact that story is something that a lot of art forms have kind of reached for.
Like there's a common adage that all games can be kind of traced back to one or two things, either Star Wars or Lord of the Rings.
The seedbed that games came out of. Pen and paper, tabletop, role-playing games, science fiction, fantasy games.
Like what is the intent? That it's something that immediately comes to mind when you look at a painting. That you think about, partly like all the colors and shapes and whatever, but you're really like immediately honing in on what is the intent, what are they trying to say, and with games, it's fairly rare that comes up, but I think all the IGF Narrative Awards, or Narrative nominees for this year do a great job of that.
Most art forms kind of escape the prison of story in various ways. Movies did it by embracing the things that made movies movies. So the first movies were like stage plays, right? And that was really uninteresting and didn't work, and it took someone like Orson Welles.
Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow?
30 Flights of Loving is a kind of a narrative experiment. It kind of purposely removes a lot of traditional gameplay elements and kind of just focuses primarily just on telling story and interesting ways of telling stories.
One of your pillars is to deliver a cinematic experience, a very linear storyline. You want to be very careful about the lighting and the staging of the characters. I think there's a lot to learn from movies. My personal preference is that the strength of games is them being interactive. And the more freedom you allow the player to explore the storyline that you've developed, whatever method that is, I think that makes for a richer game experience.
You know, the experience of playing Dear Esther, a lot of what goes on in a player's head is just, you know, digesting what is there and making connections inside. That is, you know, effectively the gameplay, that it's all internal to the player's head, and it's hard to wrap your head around that as a designer. It's like a gameplay mechanic, and it serves, you know, some of the same functions, but is very different.
I didn't expect that people would turn out solely narrative-focused interactive experiences like Dear Esther and To the Moon. Like, that did not pop up on my radar. I mean, and you know, in retrospect, I think that it makes sense that, you know what, why don't we make stories interactive and just make it a story rather than a game. But the thought of them actually commercially releasing something like that hadn't even popped up on my radar until those experiences popped up. And I'm like, you know what, wow, I really enjoy these 4-hour experiences like I would, you know, or longer, and I really want to play them.
Recently, some of the more interesting narrative games oddly have had, you know, seemingly very little gameplay in them. I mean, something like Dear Esther is kind of the pinnacle of that, where the player makes, there's almost no gameplay. You know, it's just continuing to move forward, but there's a lot that goes on inside the player's head, and it's difficult as a designer to look at that, and I'm really impressed that, you know, the game came out at all and that people have embraced it so much, because on paper it looks like that would be so boring. But there's a lot that's going on just in your own head that keeps that exciting and interesting. And, you know, I think that a lot of that is just like it's a well-told story, and it's paced well, and it uses game mechanics and sort of like the language of moving through a first-person space, but doesn't use, you know, things like challenge and, you know, time pressure and things that we're sort of used to being in games. So I don't know if that's a sustainable path, you know, if you can keep moving forward and people will, you know, continually be interested in that, or if that's sort of, you know, an evolutionary dead end that points to, you know, a way. But I think that it definitely shows that we don't need as much gameplay as we may think we do initially, that there are other things that, you know, are compelling and satisfying and interesting.
From up on the cliffs they are mundane, but down here they fugue into ambiguity.
My personal take is that when you do make a game, that you have to try to do things that take advantage of the video game format, you know, which is interactivity, which is giving the player, you know, control over the character to actually do things. You know, to let players kind of explore the world and kind of find things out on their own, to let them make connections.
I'm curious, what are your thoughts on 30 Flights of Loving?
I don't get it. I played it recently, and yeah, I'm not sure. I think I was missing something. I really love the art style, and I think he does a great job of, you know, adding cuts and things from sort of a more filmic language into a gameplay context. But I didn't quite understand what was going on, and then I played it through again with the commentary mode, and I think commentary mode is actually something I wish all games would do.
So I studied film in college, so I'm really a huge fan of watching movies. I love, you know, making my own little movie projects. And there are times where I play games and it makes me think, like, why is this thing a game? This would actually function better as a TV show or a book or a, you know, movie. Because, you know, you go down these hallways, these corridors, and the same scripted things happens every time.
Genova Chen from That Game Company has a phrase, I don't know if he's ever used it publicly, but I've heard him describe it as gameplay, of graphics and gameplay.
Even as far back as Half-Life 1, people recognized how much it added to the gaming experience, actually to have characters interacting with you in the environment, even in a non-traditional story-heavy game like a first-person shooter. I think people recognize that story actually adds a great deal of entertainment value to games, and while that would seem like a no-brainer to us, games hadn't traditionally been known for like having really strong storylines or putting a lot of emphasis on that.
Games are attracted to stories because we are attracted to stories. And I think the biggest, most pressing question right now is, how do games tell stories? What are they good at? What are they bad at? And I think we've seen that games are really good at a kind of huge, spectacle-laden story that takes all these kinds of languages from cinema and, you know, puts them into game form. And that was pretty cool, and that has been pretty cool. But I think we're seeing more and more amongst designers and gamers and critics alike a kind of hunger to do stories that fit more comfortably within the video game frame.
maybe two of the most important games of the past decade or so are Dwarf Fortress and DayZ. Those are games where story is done in a way that I feel that only video games can do, and that's kind of what makes them so, and so impactful, so compelling. These are not things like FTL or roguelikes in general, or these are stories that, the designer didn't really plan out, or there was no writer writing them. These are things that the players themselves are generating.
The democratization of game development, so we're seeing people, certainly in the case of Dysphoria, a game about, a transgendered person, exploring hormone replacement therapy is not something that, you're going to find like a 100-person team is going to get behind, but you can have one person that will do that, and then, it's interesting for themselves and for everybody else, kind of get a view into that. So I think games are becoming more personal as, we go along.
I look at Fez. I thought that was a beautifully personal statement, a wonderful evocation of what playing games as a kid was like, an amazing piece of meta analysis of what old school gameplay was like, and that game felt like a bloody tear from the eye of someone who was desperately trying to communicate.
I think that the fact that last year, The Walking Dead game came out, and while some elements of that game are very, adventure game oriented, the fact that a good chunk of that game is about the character interactions, the reactivity you get with those characters, Lee Everett's experience, and I think that the fact that the Walking Dead game had such a mature approach to the storyline, they did a lot of things that I think skilled writers do in terms of, they don't give you everything up front. They sort of lure you in with a sense of mystery, what's up with Lee, why is he arrested, what's going on in his background, what's being hinted at. And they even give you an opportunity to sort of use the visuals to help reinforce the storytelling too. When you're adventuring through episode 1, there's things that the player can pick up on that you realize are rounding out your character's story, even though the character isn't saying anything about it. So they're introducing a really nice element of subtext in that game too.
Games don't do exposition very well.
So I am the kind of player that when I play a game that has a bunch of text bubbles, I am the person that just smashes the enter button trying to skip past all of them.
We tried to make a game that had no cutscenes because I think, conventional wisdom is that you never want to take control of the player, that you always want to give, the player as much control as you can, and I think that's not necessarily something that you should strive for. That nobody wants to have control taken away for 20 minutes and watch a pre-rendered cutscene. I think that all went out with Final Fantasy VII.
Show don't tell is a writing truism, right? But it's also bullshit. And I used to teach creative writing, and I would always tell my students, you tell things all the time. In a piece of fiction, you're always telling people things. What the rule should be is strategically show and tell.
But there is a point where taking control from the player actually can help the narrative.
The only caveat is we recognize that because we're doing a game first, the game systems should always have a higher precedence than any narrative elements. A narrative should actually be supporting the game mechanics whenever possible. So when we're doing Planescape Torment, for example, we recognize that, we don't want to have loading screens. We don't want to slow the action down for the players.
These letterboxes would come down, and we had a playtest with Robin Hunicke from That Game Company, and we noticed that when the letterboxes came down, she would look over and take a drink and eat some chips. It was a playtest, and we'd given her some snacks, and so we started calling the letterboxes snack bars. When the letterboxes come down, that's where they feel like they can take a break and take a little bit of whatever they're eating or drinking at the time. And that's really useful for pacing, and something that games have a hard time with because we're not necessarily in control of things. We cede a lot of control over to the player. It's making sure that we've got these moments where the pacing is not as extreme.
If I had to choose between having writing and text on the screen or not, I would rather choose to instead convey information in a more in a way that the players can discover on their own, to let them visually see things instead of just reading a wall of text.
Games like Half-Life, BioShock, they make a really strong effort to let you see the story that's taking place in the world, the arrangement of objects. And Fallout 3 and New Vegas were really good with this too, in terms of how you do prop placement. So when a player walks into a scene, they can see how all the objects are laid out. And if the world builders have done their job, that layout's actually telling a story that you can see once you piece together all the pieces of information.
Rapture can become your city as well.
To me, exposition in a certain kind of game is really the enemy. It's all about being evocative and interesting. And you can do exposition in a much more economical way than most games choose to do it.
One big issue I have sometimes with games is that lore and sort of like the world background tends to be very exposition heavy. And I've certainly been guilty of that, doing that in games that I've worked on. But what we try and do when we're developing storylines for games, and that transitions into what we're trying to do with Eternity and what we did with like Wasteland 2, for example, we always ask that when we have a lore element or if we're trying to develop a faction or a culture, the big question we always ask is, why would the player care about this? Like, why is it important to the player?
Because it creates engagement, it creates a rich world, it gives you all those feelings that what you're in is bigger than your little slice of the game you're playing, right? It implies that there's this huge environment around you.
For example, when we were doing like Fallout New Vegas, for example, we weren't trying to do a cinematic game at all. We recognized we are trying to make an open world experience just like Fallout 3, and as such, the player should be able to experience the story, the characters, the backdrop, all at their own pace. And I think that transitions into some of our design elements with lore.
However, way too many games, in my opinion, view lore as the thing that people want. And a certain kind of game puts its lore up front and uses its lore as a selling point for how wonderful and rich and deep the game world is, and I think that's a catastrophic mistake.
There are so many ways of telling a story in a game. Like, Journey's story and method of storytelling obviously is a lot different than New Vegas. My personal preference, just from an opinion standpoint, is the more you can do with visuals and prop placement and even things like graffiti in the environment to drive home a message, there are so much more elements to bring across a storyline rather than just text.
Because to communicate that lore, what do you have to do? You have to find miraculously thorough books. You have to find all these game-stopping memos or talk to these people who, you know, if it's a game like Skyrim, you click on, I want to talk to this person, and suddenly you have 15 conversation options about like the magic tree and the courtyard of the castle. And personally, I'm just sick of that. Making a satisfying experience is not necessarily about challenge, which usually gameplay boils down to I have the thing that I want to do, and then I have to manipulate the world in order to bring that about. But games don't necessarily have to be about that. It's interesting to try and see what we can do without that.
I think when I was younger, definitely the criteria for a game was, all right, I needed to have awesome graphics. I needed it to be 40 hours long. I needed it to be, full of cool explosions.
Far Cry 3, I thought, had a lot of great, awesome characters. It had a lot of great little dialogue moments. Leave the island, stay with Citra. Binary choices aren't that interesting. To me, the next real revolution is going to be a generation of game designers and game writers that figure out that often what is most significant in a game experience are the littler choices. A game that, to me, braids gameplay and story in a way that felt just awesome from beginning to end is Dark Souls, Demon Souls. And those aren't very written games, you'll notice. They're in fact kind of obdurately not written. There's not that much text or not that much dialogue in those games at all. But you always feel like the tiniest gameplay thing you do has expressive connotations as to who you are as a player and what it means in the game world. And I really do think there's lots of space in games to do that kind of thing.
Hey, Clementine.
Hey, Lee.
I've only played the first episode of The Walking Dead, but I thought the story was fantastically written in terms of motivating the gameplay.
That Walking Dead did a really good job of taking game-isms and making it as though you were like looking into a bunch of people in this horrible situation. And I'm sick with admiration for how well that game did so much of what it tried to do, and how much I really loved Lee and Clem by the end of the game, and how important their relationship to me became. I mean, just hats off. When you can create that kind of feeling, When you can take people that are animated in this kind of chunky graphic novel style and make me feel as though the psychological well-being of my entire night is riding on how I respond to a little girl needing her hair cut, that's great.
I love The Walking Dead, yeah. I kind of grew up on adventure games, on the old Sierra and LucasArts adventure games. And then the adventure game kind of like went into a lull for a bit, and I was so happy to see this Walking Dead come out for these modern audiences. You know, I like that kind of purposely removes a lot of the, I guess, what can be seen as kind of the silly gameplay elements from adventure games. Like, you know, use the wax paper on the door to start the fire, to whatever it is. And they just kind of like purposely, you know, stripped or streamlined all of that out and just focuses on really, really quality writing, which is hard to do in games and you don't see much of, and they really nailed it.
I used to think better writing was the answer to what bedeviled game storytelling, and I now believe, having done this for a couple years now, that better writing isn't really the solution.
But seeing that level of mature storytelling, like in the Walking Dead game, I thought was a prime example of like a really great effort to make a quality story experience.
Better writing is certainly not something to be sneezed at. We all want our games to be thoughtful and interesting and have cool characters and have good dialogue and stuff like that. But it's really, to me, just creating better systems to interact with each other in ways that bring out the things that make game storytelling cool.
You can make a game where the story is more of the forefront than the system mechanics, and I think that's one of the critiques that we had about Planescape Torment, for example, was that the systems definitely felt secondary to the storyline. Although we did try and make sure the actual dialogue mechanics in that game actually were a game system in themselves, overall people did feel like things like the combat, was a little weaker than it should have been. Some of the exploration spaces probably weren't as spread out as they should have been because there was such a focus on narrative.
How do you blend, narrative and gameplay that often, naively, if you just try to smush them together, will absolutely fight with each other. And it's something, there's just a disconnect, even in really well-polished, enjoyable games like, for example, Uncharted. The game does not call your attention to the fact that you've just killed like 200 people, but if you're playing it and trying to evaluate it, it's sort of hard not to remember that all of these, casual, witty remarks are being said by a man who just, completely obliterated, basically like a small village.
Enjoying yourself, pal? Oh yeah, you're a comedian.
Indie game designers are the people that are going to make this medium have the radiance of a real work of art, which is one human being sending out an arc of connection to another human being, hoping they catch it, hoping they connect, hoping you can communicate something of what it means to be alive and what it means to be a person.
And it's great too that the IGF is being out there and sort of calling attention to these things, because I think it's going to encourage a lot of players to give games a try that they might not have seen. And the more players sort of get used to playing games that are outside of their comfort zone, that are not just about throwing grenades behind cover or whatever it is, I think that's going to be better for players and developers.
Yeah, I was lucky that Steve Gaynor sent me a build of Gone Home, and I was lucky enough to play it. And it was definitely a game that I wished would exist. Like when I play first-person shooter games, I always have that thought, it's like, oh my god, this game would be so, not necessarily better, but it would be so interesting to see like if they just stripped out all the bad guys and just kind of let me explore the world and just talk to characters. This would be totally something I would love to do. I remember playing, I think, Far Cry 1, and it's this beautiful, gorgeous tropical island. I thought, oh my god, I would love to just walk around and not be shot by dudes every 10 seconds. Or even like, BioShock or Half-Life. Just like explore these cool, creative, beautiful environments and just kind of soak in the world and just kind of explore the world.
When it comes to atmosphere, I think the best examples I have again are like with Half-Life and things like BioShock. And I do agree that I think games have a more powerful ability to evoke an atmosphere because of the immediacy, the fact that you're not necessarily locked into the filmmaker's view of how they want you to experience it. Everybody, when they're interacting with a medium, is adding some of their own personal experience to what's going on. And I think games allow for more of that, which I think is important.
I think the big challenge for any video game, because we don't have real people, that if you have in TV or film, you have this advantage of two human beings that are talking to each other, and there's all this wiring in our brains that is programmed, to like tell us about human beings, and immediately babies cue in on faces, and there's just so much more, even from a boring scene of two humans talking, where like 30 Flights of Living is just two cubes that have faces painted on them, that is a struggle.
I mean, I'd say that right now is that I still kind of see games as kind of being in a very, there's a lot of unexplored territory. So I'd always encourage others to, to try to do something that might not necessarily have been done before, and might sound incredibly dumb. Like, I have to admit that when I made 30 Flights of Loving, the idea of making a game that was about 15 minutes long, it was something that I would have never really done on my own. Largely the reason I did it was because the Adult Thumbs guy said, let's just make this small game and see what happens. And I'm glad I did it because it actually turned out pretty well.
Like when we get budding narrative designers who ask how to improve their craft, my advice isn't always just to do more writing, it's to pay more attention to sound, how a scene is laid out, how an area is laid out, and figure out how that tells a story.
To me, the challenge is, for good storytelling in games, is figuring out that games are not a writer's medium. They're never going to be. And Walking Dead aside, which is totally a writer's game, that's still not a writer's medium in the sense that nobody is there for how completely eloquent and well-written the script is, right? That game is more of kind of an actor's game than a writer's game because everything's riding on how those people sound. So the one thing I've become convinced doing this is, as a writer who writes video games, you have to get out of the way and you have to let the game be what it needs to be. The only way you can write a good game is to get into the world, these largely unbuilt worlds that just kind of are half-built and run around and figure out what's interesting, what draws your attention as a player, and then redoing the script to kind of bounce off this real place. I called it reporting. You start as a fiction writer and you end as a reporter, which to me was the most revelatory aspect of writing the game. Game storytelling right now, at this moment while we're sitting here in Los Angeles, California, is a way more varied and much, much richer world than I think a lot of us are willing to acknowledge. To me, it's the most exciting kind of narrative art form out there, and I hope I can keep doing it for a while.